All right, hi everybody, my name is Blue Nagoon, and I'm going to break down my track Ballistic Frizzle. Now this track came out of a production challenge. The challenge was to combine kawaii future bass with synthwave into a new genre called kawaii wave. Now I don't claim to be a professional music producer by any stretch, but over the past few years I have learned a lot by watching other people's breakdown videos and instructional videos, and so I thought I'd try to pay that forward by putting one of mine out there. And now honestly, the lessons you take from this might be things not to do, because I do cut corners, especially during one of these challenges where you only have 30 days to completely produce a track. But there's enough weird little things going on in this track in particular that I thought it would be a good candidate for a breakdown video, and perhaps it will be useful to you. So there's two main chord progressions in the song. They are both very much J-pop chord progressions. And I just want to lean into that to kind of sell the kawaii aspect of things. The song is in the key of C because it's 2020 and that's where I'm at as far as mental capacity. C is just fine. The main chord progression is this standard 4-5-3-6 chord progression. Every anime theme ever. And I have a couple variations on it throughout the song, and that's these first couple lines here. The first and main variation that you hear the most often is this one here, where in place of the 6th chord, I have this little walk-up figure. The rhythm lends itself very well to like tom fills and some, adding sound effects and some cool kind of transitional stuff. And so you'll hear that a lot in the song. So the final variation of the chord progression is another J-pop characteristic where they take the 6th chord at the end and make it major. And oftentimes they'll do that and it doesn't really serve a harmonic function, except, that sounds kind of cool. It gives it kind of a happy, bright sound. But for me, my B chord progression down here starts on D. A is the 5 of D, and so I used it as a 5 of 2 to give a little harmonic tension and push into the next section. So that leads me to my B section chords, and it's a 2-5-1, D minor, G, C, and then it has that major 6th chord to lead us back to the D again. And then the last time around, it stops on the 1, and that's the end of the song. I'm a big fan of flat 9 chords, so I added a flat 9 to this A7 to just jazz it up. All right, so let's dive in. The first sound that you hear in the song is this playground ambience. I guess to be completely on theme, I probably should have tried to find a playground in Japan sound, but I think this one is from Germany. It's from Free to Use Sounds. The idea here was just to establish that this is going to be sort of a happy, jolly song, and, kind of set the tone at the beginning. So then the piano comes in, and for my piano, I'm using a Grandeur by Native Instruments. As is common to a lot of my tracks, I just roll off a little low end to get out of the way of the bass and the kick, a little bit of compression, and then the CQ. And CQ is from Sound Toys. I don't claim to understand it completely, but the high knob especially is just magical. It adds some nice air and just sounds good here. Just gives it a little bit of shimmer on the high end, and there's Ableton not letting go of the sustain pedal. It loves to do that. There we go. All right, next up is the glockenspiel, which seemed to be a pretty crucial element to the kawaii sound. All right, so that leads us to the arps, and of course the arps are a major part of the synthwave sound. So I've got a couple different sounds here. They're all from UVI Falcon, a couple libraries, tweaked presets kind of thing. But this sound here, pretty standard brassy sound, layered with a very old school dry brassy sound to just give it a little more edge. And then there's a second arp that comes in that is more percussive. This is more of a background arp underneath some of the leads that are going on. What's happening at the transition section is the filters are opening up slowly. It's the classic, slow opening filter kind of synthwave sound. But it also has an LFO on it that's just continuously modulating it up and down with a little bit of resonance, and that continues even when it comes in all the way, although it's less noticeable then. But it just gives it a little bit of motion, a little bit of interest, so it's not a completely static part. And then the last thing that I have on that is a plugin called Track Spacer, and this is just kind of a little cheat code for mixing, really. It's a auto EQ sidechain, so basically you tell it what track to listen to, and it ducks this track at those frequencies. So it's a nice way to just get something out of the way of something else really easily. The place that it's being used in this song is when the electric guitar solo happens. It's ducking out of the way of electric guitar. So if I take it off, you can hear it has so many frequencies that are competing with the electric guitar. If I turn it on, it just ducks those a little bit. I'm not using it at a super high ratio. So, of course, being a synthwave track, you've got to have the big arp bass going. And then for the other parts of the track that aren't as synthwavy, I needed a nice fat kind of subby sound that I also used for the slower coda at the end. And for the sub bass, I mean, all that's on it is it's just a sub with some saturation. It just brings out a ton of that mid-range and makes it a little easier to hear. And then at the end, a sidechain compressor kicks in on the kick just for that legato part to let the kick poke through. For the arp bass, this is a very standard saw wave bass sound. I have a chorus on it. It's a very classic Tal chorus. I have a utility on here just to keep the bass, the very low bass mono, some EQ here, some sidechain compression on the kick. That's basically what's going on. The one thing I'll point out about the EQ is that I have this little notch upward here. A lot of the times with synthwave bass, I need it to cover the low end, but then I also need it to get the rhythmic element. You need a little of this kind of growly part of the bass. And so that often gets overwritten by, or, it's often competing with the more mid-range elements of the mix. So what I'll do is I'll go through some of those competing elements and I'll put an EQ on it. I just call it bass notch. I'll just do a little cut on the other ones to let it through. And it's a real subtle thing, but it does allow some of that bass to pop out of the mix. I use XLN XO for my drum finding, and I just have a big, as you can see, a giant folder of samples that I just throw everything in. Oh, hey, there's a free sample pack. Let's grab it and throw it in there, and then it becomes something I can choose from. Now, when I'm doing a track like this where I knew that I wanted the synthwave drums, the 707, the Linn drum, the DMX, the Simmons, those very specific 80s drum machines, some 808 and 909 also, but mainly those four. And so I carefully picked the sounds that I'm using for this. So I've got my 707 kick, classic Linn drum snappy snare, layered with another Linn snare that's pitched way down to get that big body sound to it. So those play together. Then I've got a classic Simmons crack kind of sound for some of the fills. And then I've got, of course, the Simmons toms. Being synthwave, you got to have crap loads of reverb on everything. So there's two reverbs on the drums. There's one to give it sort of a it's in a room sound, and then there's one to give it it's in a cathedral sound. Toms basically have some saturation on them and some like a gated reverb type reverb. Just give it a little body. And then we get to this kawaii future bass kind of section that I wanted to have in the song with the big supersaws and all that sort of thing. Right here, I call it my ridiculous tom rack. This is an XO session that is basically 8 tom sounds. I was imagining, the 80s, those hair metal bands, some of those drummers would have these ridiculous drum kits where they had, 2 racks of rototoms ahead of like 4 or 5 other toms in their drum kit. I was like, oh man, I gotta put some of that stuff in there. So for this saw break, I have these silly toms in here. And it's, again, just saturation and gated reverb kind of sound. The supersaws, I've got the CQ for the high end, a little bit of reverb on it. It's a pretty tight reverb sound. I wanted it to have some ambience, but not enough to be big and washy. I wanted this section to stand in contrast to the big washy reverby synthy section. And while we're at this section, we'll talk about all the crazy sound effects going on that make it goofy and kawaii. But this one is a rack of random sound effects from the 2600 synthesizer that I got from Samples from Mars. And so I can just play them on the keyboard. And so I just jammed along to this part and found a couple sounds that I liked, panned them a little bit to the right, and then panned a little to the left is the same idea with classic arcade video game samples. I just dumped them all into Falcon, mapped them out so that I could play them on the keyboard. I'm sure that you recognize some of those. They're pretty classic. And again, I just jammed out some patterns. I have these flamenco feet because I thought that kind of fit the mood of what was going on. And then I had a couple other transitions going on, like this one. And then I have this one, which is a choir rise sound from orchestral library, which sounds really spooky on its own. But in the context of the track, it sounds like a bunch of people are about to like cheer. All right, so the next section, there's this kind of funky transition here. Kawaii wave seems to have a lot of chromatic movement in the chords, so I was just like, let's take a cudgel and just insert some chromatic movement as a transition. I also added in this filtering effect on almost all the tracks. You know, a standard filter opening, but going in both directions. And it just gives it a really nice blooming sound. All right, so after that transition, there's an electric guitar and synth lead solo where the two sounds are layered. Panned out slightly to give them their own space. The electric guitar sound comes from Line 6 Helix Native. The amp sim is a simulation of a matchless DC-30 amp going into a Zilla cabinet impulse response. For the electric guitar, I basically carve out just the frequencies I want, nothing else. I put a flanger on it to kind of add to that smooth electronic sort of feel I'm going for with these layering of these two sounds. There's a CQ for a little bit of high end, and then Gullfoss, which is a plugin that is designed to unmask frequencies that are getting masked in the signal. And then a little bit of compression, of course, and it goes into a lot of reverb and some delay as well. The Coda is, again, it's the B chords that I talked about at the beginning. It's got this bell synthesizer. I thought the glockenspiel was a little harsh for this section, so this is a mellower bell. It's funny now that I say that and I listen to it, it's like, it sounds super harsh, but it works better in the mix than the glockenspiel did. And then this is a synth pad sound that is running through RC Retro Color to just give kind of a little bit of lo-fi feel. Oh, and taking the place of the snare in this section is the low tom, and a delay turns on just for this section. And then another little synth solo, and we're done. That's the end of the song. I have two effect sends in the project. One is a large hall reverb sound that almost everything is sent to a certain extent. Again, stylistically, going for lots of big space. And then I have a delay that I send a few things to here and there throughout the track. And on the master fader, here's where it's most obvious that I cut some corners. Because of the way I was composing the song, where I was just adding tracks, changing tracks, throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks, I wasn't very careful about putting a utility on each track and setting the gain to like -10 to -16, just so that when I started layering things, I didn't slam the master too hard. So I wasn't leaving any headroom at all. And so the first thing on the master fader here is a utility just dropping the gain to a more manageable level. Probably not the ideal way to do it, but it worked for this. All right, and then I have just a little compression on the entire mix to put things in a box a little bit. And I have some tape emulation kind of for the same purpose, although I do like this tape emulation, the way that it boosts the lows with the head bump setting. I'll crank it up here. It just gives a really nice boost to the low end, although at that extreme setting, it's a little much. All right, thank you so much for watching. I hope that this was somewhat useful. Please feel free to get in touch with questions and that sort of thing. I'm always happy to talk music with people. I am a music teacher by day, so if you're looking for music lessons, you can get in touch for that as well.